This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason. So if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 53 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, June 1st, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Before we get started, I do have to let everybody know there is currently a survey that is active for the show, and it will only be active until June 15th. That's going to be in 2 weeks from when this episode airs. So there are 2 weeks ahead that you guys can take this survey. It's just kind of a general demographics survey of the podcast. There will be a link for it on the Facebook page as well as in the show notes, but it's survey.libsyn.com/Naked Mormonism Podcast. If you don't mind going on to that link and taking the entire about 35 seconds that it takes to fill out the survey, that would be deeply appreciated and it would really help out the show in the long run. But with that being said, let's jump into the wrap up for today's episode. That's going to be the milk, covering the last historical episode, and then we're going to jump into the meat for today. So the last historical timeline episode covered the letter exchanges going in and out of Liberty Jail. Rigdon made a plea in the court of habeas corpus and was essentially allowed to escape, which left Caleb Baldwin, Alexander McCrae, and Lyman White interred in the Liberty Prison dungeon with the prophet and his brother Hiram. They were seemingly relieved to be relieved of Rigdon's whining and maniacal spells of impending apocalypse and untold persecution, but the remaining months ahead of them in that dungeon, it wasn't really like a stroll through the woods. I mean, the most important part of it, Joe's power was really threatened by his absence. The Saints were being removed actively from Missouri, forced to flee from the mobocrat militias who were enforcing the surrender negotiations agreed upon in November of 1838. The Mormons were to be exterminated, removed, essentially from Missouri. Luckily, Illinois was nice enough to take the refugees. So Joe was trying to run his church from prison, but it was in complete disarray regardless of his presence. His internment didn't help with the organization, though. It caused power struggles and executive decisions to be made by people who were legitimate threats to Joe's authority. And whether those people realized that they were threats at that time isn't necessarily clear, but Joe knew. He was afraid of what Rigdon would do as soon as he got to Quincy without Joe there to naysay him or keep him reined in. And this was a rational fear. Hingepin Rigdon and Joe as business partners had a sordid past, even as good friends. Go back to episodes 26 through 28 to hear about the power struggles between them, and you can see how they kind of developed a respect for each other in the wake of claiming that each other had, lost the keys to prophecy, and they had, what I think to be a physical fight. Power between them was a constant ebb and flow, and, Joe probably felt threatened with Rigdon and Quincy handling things in his absence. But unfortunately, Joe didn't realize that Rigdon wasn't anywhere near as much of a threat as some others who were handling business in Illinois. The Quorum of the 12 had assumed all leadership roles, and they performed some executive actions, which should have been handled by vote, and the vote should have been called for by Joe and the presidency. Instead, Bloody Brigham Young was handling the role of executive quite well, might I add, merely whetting his palate for what the future held. We'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a minute here. But we read through a bunch of letters the last episode, and they were just exchanged between various leaders and loved ones who were interred in Liberty Jail. We read a letter that Joe wrote to Prescindia Huntington Buell, who would become one of his polygamous wives, as well as to his actual wife that he wrote to, Emma. We finished up that episode talking about a guy named Isaac Galland, who we'll discuss in a little more detail today, with a conclusion talking about Rigdon's possible faith crisis during the entire Liberty Jail affair and everything which led up to and followed it. But that does it for the milk today, so why don't we take a bite out of the meat and see where it leads us down the never-ending labyrinth of rabbit holes that is Mormon history. Bloody Brigham Young was operating as president of the church in Joe's absence. He didn't have a problem making necessary executive decisions. And we talked last episode about how Edward Partyboy Partridge said that he didn't want to help the Saints from Missouri and that he'd been able to get there himself, that the Saints should be able to do the same. But being the pragmatist that he was, Bloody Brigham was a little more charitable, setting him and Partyboy Partridge at odds. Brigham was essentially the interim supreme leader of the church, which is good because he was an awesome businessman. Without Brigham Young's insights and influence, the church likely would never have survived, and the Mormons sure as hell never would have made it out to Utah. Let me give you an example of Brigham's smart managerial tactics, which contributed directly to the survival of the Mormons. This example comes from the end of the Nauvoo years after Joe's death in the Carthage gunfight, and it's something that I actually learned from the local blacksmith shop when I was in Nauvoo during the Mormon history tour. But when Bloody Brigham took over the church in Nauvoo and devised the overall plan to go to the Rocky Mountains to build a safe haven, he knew it was going to be a logistical nightmare getting over 10,000 people moved over 1,200 miles to settle in an area that was ruled by a chaotic mix of like Native Americans and mountain men and then just savage frontier outlaws. Brigham devised an early assembly line kind of system to mass produce wagons and handcarts. Now, there were multiple shops around Nauvoo that were dedicated to building just one small piece of the wagons. The box, the wheels, suspension systems, stuff like that. So each of these shops mass produced those parts to specific measurements, and then were able to manufacture thousands of wagons to get everybody across the plains. Creating this mass production system was impressive in and of itself, and we can credit Bloody Brigham with having the foresight to implement it long before Henry Ford was even born at this time. But beyond the mass production system was also a calculated shipping system for each wagon. Now, each wagon could carry 2,000 pounds of cargo. Brigham implemented a system where each cart would carry 1,000 pounds of that family's personal possessions and 1,000 pounds of stuff that the rest of the wagon train needed, like bulk food items, extra wagon parts, water, blacksmithing stuff, things that they needed to get set up in Utah, those staples and necessities. They did this, and they survived, showing just how brilliant of a businessman Brigham Young actually was. His leadership got those people to Utah and established the Brighamite Mormon Church. His strong business traits were being exercised in a healthy manner during the Mormon settlement in Illinois. With Joe and Hiram absent, Brigham stepped up to the plate and handled some organization and business items to help keep the Saints alive. Rigdon was Bloody Brigham's only competitor. This time during the early organization of the Nauvoo, Illinois settlements was when Rigdon developed a healthy new respect and probably fear of who Bloody Brigham was starting to become. Brigham purged the leadership and put his own guy, Wilford Woodruff, into the quorum. That same Woodruff who would become the fourth prophet of the Brighamite Church. In addition, Brigham kept a tight set of reins on other members of the leadership, making sure that Joe would be happy with Brigham's work upon his return from jail. Now, a guy named Jonathan Dunham stepped out of line when he went to Springfield and held a conference in opposition to Joe's wishes, and we're about to read about that. This is from Volume 3, page 259 of the History of the Church, Source and Critical Text Edition by Dan Vogel. Quote, Sunday, March 17th, 1839. Extract from the minutes of the Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints held in Quincy on March 17th. Brigham Young was unanimously called to the chair and Robert B. Thompson chosen clerk. Now it goes on to quote the minutes from the actual meeting here, and it says, Elder Young then arose and gave a statement of the circumstances of the church at Far West, and his feelings in regard to the scattering of the brethren, believing it to be wisdom to unite together as much as possible in extending the hand of charity for the relief of the poor who were suffering under the hand of persecution in Missouri, and to pursue that course that would prove for the general good of the whole church who were suffering for the gospel's sake, and would advise the saints to settle, if possible, in companies or in a situation so as to be organized into churches, that they might be nourished and fed by the shepherds, for without the sheep would be scattered. And he also impressed it upon the minds of the saints to give heed to the revelations of God. Especially the elders should be careful to depart from all iniquity, and to remember the counsel given by those whom God hath placed as counselors in the church, that they may become as wise stewards in the vineyard of the Lord, that every man may know and act in his own place. For there is order in the kingdom of God, and we must regard that in order if we expect to be blessed. So essentially, we're going to keep reading from that here in a second, but I'm just going to summarize. Essentially, Brigham Young said we need to divide up into smaller churches and set up a middle management system in order to make sure that everybody is accounted for and taken care of. Because, I mean, how does one group of 12 people possibly handle all of the logistics of over 10,000 starving refugees? It's simply impossible. It continues on in the passage of the history of the church, quote, Elder Young also stated that Elder Jonathan Dunham had received previous instructions not to call any conference in this state or elsewhere, but to go forth and preach repentance, which was his calling. But contrary to those instructions, he called a conference in Springfield, Illinois, and presided there, and brought forth the business which he had to transact, and his proceedings in many respects during the conference was contrary to the feelings of Elder W. Woodruff and other official members who were present. They considered his proceedings contrary to the will and order of God. Now we get to the point where the meeting here is chastising Elder Jonathan Dunham because he held his own meeting, which was against Joseph Smith's direct wishes. It continues, the conference then voted that Elder J. Dunham be reproved for his improper course, and that he be advised to adhere to the counsel given him. And after transacting various on other business, Elder George W. Harris made some remarks relative to those who had left us in the time of our perils, persecutions, and dangers, and were acting against the interest of the church, and that the church could no longer hold them in fellowship unless they repented of their sins and turned to God. Now we get to Brigham Young's purge. After the conference fully expressed their feelings upon the subject, it was unanimously voted that the following persons be excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints: George M. Hinkle, Samson Avard, John Correll, Reed Peck, William Wines Phelps, Frederick G. Williams, Thomas B. Marsh, Burr Riggs, and several others, after which the conference closed by prayer. Signed, Brigham Young President, Robert B. Thompson Clerk. End quote. Okay, what did we just read? So while Joe and friends were toiling with, trying somehow to run the church from Liberty Jail, and at the same time Hinchpin Rigdon was getting settled on that little farm that he was renting from Isaac Galland near Commerce, Bloody Brigham was running the show and proceeded to transact business and chastise people like Elder Jonathan Dunham for their improper course, which really could mean a number of things during this fragile time in Mormon history. And, of course, Bloody Brigham took this conference as an opportunity to excommunicate nearly every person who testified against the leadership during the November Court of Inquiry. Joe had no idea that this had happened until after he busted out of the joint. Rigdon wasn't even present at this conference. Joe told them explicitly to not hold any conferences until he could get there, which is why Jonathan Dunham was being chastised in the first place. Which, that's really just an absurd thing to say, because of course these people are going to need to have meetings to figure out just what the hell they're going to do with over 10,000 refugees moving into a dinky little swampland on the Illinois banks of the Mississippi. Bloody Brigham took charge and handled business as it needed to be handled. At this same time, let's jump briefly back to the prison cell. Joe received word that Isaac Galland, the guy that owned the ton of land in Illinois and Iowa, had met with Israel Barlow and Hinchpin Rigdon, and Joe told them to go forward with the agreed upon terms. This is a couple of excerpts from the letter that Joe sent to Isaac Galland on March 22nd, 1839. This was 5 days after that passage that we read about Brigham Young cleansing the leadership and putting in his guy Wilford Woodruff. This is hosted on the josephsmithpapers.org, and there will be a link to it in the show notes. Quote, Mr. Isaac Galland, dear sir, I have been privileged with a perusal of a letter put into my hands by Mr. David W. Rogers, which letter was directed to him, dated February 26, 1839, and signed Isaac Galland. The contents of said letter expresses a sympathy and good feelings toward the people of the Church of Latter-day Saints, which I have the high honor of being their religious leader. I say high honor, more especially, because I know them to be an honorable, a virtuous, and an upright people. And that honor, virtue, and righteousness is their only aim and object in this life. They are, sir, a much injured and abused people, and are greatly belied as to their true character. Joe is really trying to sell the Mormons to Isaac Galland here. They have been fallen upon by a gang of ruffians and murderers 3 times in the state of Missouri, and entirely broken up without having committed the first offense, or without there being the least shadow of the very slightest degree of evidence that they have done aught of anything derogatory to the laws or character of the state of Missouri. I'm going to go a little bit further down in the letter. I am bold to say, sir, that a more nefarious transaction never existed since the days of yore than that which has been practiced upon us. Myself and those who were in prison with me were torn from our houses, with our wives and children clinging to our garments under the awful expectation of being exterminated. We are kept under a strong guard night and day in a prison of double walls and doors, prescribed in our liberty of conscience. Our food is scant, uniform, and coarse. We have not the privilege of cooking for ourselves. We have been compelled to sleep on the floor with straw and not blankets sufficient to keep us warm. And when we have fire, we are obliged to have almost a constant smoke. The judges have gravely told us from time to time that they knew we were innocent and ought to be liberated, but they dare not administer the law unto us for fear of the mob. But if we will deny our religion, we can be liberated. Our lawyers have gravely told us that we are only held now by the influence of long-faced Baptists. How far this is true, we are not able to say. There you go, just an assertion. Yeah, we're held here by religious persecution, but we're not sure if it's true or not. Incredible. But we are certain that our most vehement accusers are the highest-toned professors of religion. But enough of this. I feel highly gratified to learn of a man who had sympathy and feelings of friendships towards a suffering and an injured and an innocent people. Now, that's Joe talking about Isaac Galland meta while he's writing a letter to Isaac Galland. If you can do them any good, render them any assistance or protection in the name of suffering humanity, we beseech you for God's sake and humanity's sake that you will do it. If you should see Governor Robert Lucas, I wish you would have the kindness to state to him the contents of this letter, as we know him from information to be a man of character and a gentleman. I would be glad, therefore, if it were possible, that he, and not only him, but every other patriotic and humane man, should know the real facts of our sufferings and the unjust and cruel hand that is upon us. All right, after that, it goes on through like a 6-page screed of Joe describing everything about Mormon doctrine with Bible references to back it up. And just a side note here, Joe didn't use any passages from the Book of Mormon in this letter to teach Galland about Mormon theology. He just used the Bible. The reason he was doing this was to win favor with Galland. Galland was a rich dude with many powerful friends in the Illinois and Iowa governments. He owned a ton of land. Joe wanted this guy to convert to Mormonism, and thus gave him the whole 9 yards to try and convince him of its truth. And I won't belabor you with everything Joe said. When I was reading it, I tuned most of it out because it's just typical preacher dribble that Joe was often wont to rant upon, so we're just going to fast forward through most of this letter, and this is the historically significant portion of the letter and why we are reading it in the first place. Please, sir, to pardon me for having obtruded thus lengthy upon your feelings. Yeah, that was deserving of pardon. Trust me, it is so arduous to read through. Anyway, he continues, as you are a stranger to me, and I know nothing of you, only what I have read in your letter, and from that I have taken the liberty which I have. Be assured, sir, that I have the most liberal sentiments and feelings of charity towards all sects, parties, and denominations, and the rights and liberties of conscience I hold most sacred and dear, and despise no man for differing with me in matters of opinion. Accept, dear sir, my best wishes for your welfare, and desire for further acquaintance. I close my letter by giving you some quotations which you will have the goodness to read. And then he lists a bunch of verses, and then it's signed yours truly, Joseph Smith. But there's also an NB, which is like a postscript at the bottom of the letter, and that's the historically significant portion. It says, NB, if Bishop Edward Partridge, or if the church have not made a purchase of your land, and if there is not anyone who feels a particular interest in making the purchase, you will hold it in reserve for us. We will purchase it of you at the proposals that you made to Mr. Israel Barlow. We think the church would be wise in making the contract. Therefore, if it is not made before we are liberated, we will make it. Yours, etc., Joseph Smith, Jr. End quote. Okay, actually, we were reading that entire letter just for the little NB portion, the postscript at the end of the letter. So while Rigdon and Brigham were doing their thing in Illinois to organize a church and take care of all the ecclesiastical issues and get the people settled, Joe sent this letter to Galland, basically accepting his business proposition of selling all of that acreage in Iowa and Illinois sight unseen, thus tentatively committing the church to about $50,000 of debt. Wow. So Joe read in a letter that Galland owned all this land, and then, without talking to his counselors or even seeing the property for himself, Joe gave the church the go-ahead and directly told Isaac Galland that if the church didn't buy the property that he had proposed by the time that Joe was released from jail, then Joe personally would see to it that the property was purchased, and said, you will hold on to it until we are liberated. I mean, wow. So one of two things happened with Galland. Either something in Joe's letter spoke to him, and he was converted sincerely, or he saw the Mormons as suckers, and he decided to stick around to make sure that they would purchase his land. Now, Galland was likely ecstatic that these massive chunks of land that he owned were now being purchased in a block by the Mormons, and now it was just a matter of making them flourish in the area, and everybody's land prices would go up, including his own. That's what happened in Kirtland. You know, when the Mormons started moving in, Kirtland prices exploded. But the opposite happened in Missouri. You know, Galland wanted his land in Illinois to develop like Kirtland had when the Mormons began moving in. He didn't want whatever had happened in Missouri to happen to the Mormons and their land again this time around in Illinois. But Joe wasn't done complaining to people in high places about this situation. That letter was sent on March 22nd from Liberty Jail from Joseph Smith to Isaac Galland. A week prior to that letter, Joe had dictated a letter to the Honorable Judge George Tompkins, asking for a legitimate hearing instead of that sham court of inquiry thing which had happened to land in there in the first place. So while Joe was dictating the letter to Isaac Galland telling him that the Mormons will happily buy this property, Judge Tompkins was in the middle of reading what we're about to go over and making a decision about how to handle the whole, Mormon prisoners situation. Everybody in the Missouri justice system knew that the Mormons had been shortchanged in the court of inquiry. The whole situation was such a mess, and there wasn't a whole lot of citable case law that gave them justification for holding to the surrender terms and forcing the Mormons to leave the state. The Mormons had no recourse for the people they'd lost at Haun's Mill in the Haun's Mill massacre. Joe was rotting in jail for treason and murder when some actors in the Missouri militia had done way worse shit to the Mormons and were deserving of the same or worse punishment, but nobody in the Missouri government could side with the Mormons because they were a shrinking minority, with increasingly fleeting numbers as more and more of them moved to Illinois. No politician could help the Mormons and hope to have a career in Missouri politics from then on. The term comes back to mind, political plutonium. Anybody who touched or even got near the Mormons one way or another was dead, politically speaking. So Judge Tompkins received this letter from which we're going to read a few excerpts. This is also hosted at thejosephsmithpapers.org, and there's a link to it in the show notes. Quote, "To the Honorable Judge George Tompkins, or either of the judges of the Supreme Court for the state of Missouri, your petitioners, Allenson Ripley, Heber C. Kimball, Joseph B. Noble, William Huntington, and Joseph Smith beg leave respectfully to represent to your honor that Joseph Smith Jr. is now in Liberty Jail, Clay County, Missouri, that he has been restrained of his liberty near 5 months. Your petitioners claim that the whole transaction which has been the cause of his confinement is unlawful from the first to the last. He was taken from his home by a fraud practiced upon him by a man named by the name of George M. Hinkle, and one or two others. Thereby, your petitioner respectfully shows that he was forced contrary to his wishes and without knowing the cause into the camp which was commanded by General Lucas of Jackson County, and from thence to Ray County, sleeping on the ground, and suffering many insults and injuries and deprivations, which were calculated in their nature to break down the spirits and constitution of the most robust and hardy of mankind. He was put in chains immediately on his being landed in Richmond, and there underwent a long and tedious ex parte examination. Not only was it ex parte, but your petitioners solemnly declare that it was a mock examination, that there was not the least shadow of honor or justice or law administered toward him on account of his religion, but sheer prejudice and the spirit of persecution and malice and prepossession against him on account of his religion. That the whole examinations show that the said Joseph Smith Jr. was deprived of the privilege of being examined before the court as the law directs. That the witness on the part of the state were taken by force of arms and threatened with extermination, immediate death, and were brought without subpoena or warrant under this awful and glaring anticipation of being exterminated if they did not swear something against him to please the mob or his persecutors, and those witnesses were compelled to swear at the muzzle of a gun, and that some of them have acknowledged since, which your petitioners do testify and are able to prove, that they did swear false, that they did it in order to save their lives, and your petitioners testify that all the testimony that had any tendency or bearing of criminality against said Joseph Smith Jr. is false. Okay. So I cut some of that paragraph, but that whole paragraph was one sentence. But essentially, let me summarize what was said so far. Joseph and the petitioners who are writing this letter to the Honorable Judge George Tompkins said that everything that happened in the court of inquiry was unconstitutional, and that the people that testified against Joseph Smith were caused or were forced to testify as such at the point of a gun. That the mob or the militia, or it says mob at each time. I think it only said the word militia once in here. But that the mob threatened the lives of these people, and that's why they testified it against Joseph Smith and the other Mormon leaders. And he says now that your petitioners do testify that they are able to prove that these people did swear false, and they did it to save their lives. So if Judge Tompkins hears the Mormons' case and they can somehow prove that the people that testified against them were doing so under death threats, well, that definitely adds some confounding variables to this entire court system here. But it continues on a little bit further in the letter here with more interesting excerpts. Joseph continues saying, "We are personally acquainted with the circumstances, and being with him most of the time, and being present at the time spoken of by them, therefore we know that their testimony was false. And if he could have had a fair and impartial and lawful examination before the court, and could have been allowed the privilege of introducing his witness, he could have been disproved everything that was against him. But the court suffered them to be intimidated, some of them in the presence of the court, and they were driven also and hunted, and some of them entirely driven out of the state, and thus he was not able to have a fair trial." So this is an invalid point, but a relevant complaint. Okay? Essentially, Joe is saying, I didn't even get to stand up on the trial stand. I didn't get to call any of my witnesses in defense. So the whole court of inquiry that happened and the conviction, the reason that we're being held here is completely unlawful, because if I just would have been able to call my witnesses up, then they would have proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was innocent. But that's not really what the purpose of a court of inquiry or grand trial is, or a grand jury trial is. Those are just to ascertain if there's enough guilt or possible guilt to move forward with a legitimate examination. You know, a court of inquiry in this respect, whatever that really was back then, is similar to how like a grand jury trial is. The prosecution presents its case, and then the judge decides whether or not it's good to move forward. It's not an actual jury trial. So, that's Joe's complaint. He didn't get to put any of his witnesses up. And it continues on here. "And after the examination, the said prisoner was committed to the jail for treason against the state of Missouri. Whereas the said Joseph Smith Jr. did not levy war against the state of Missouri, neither did he commit any overt acts, neither did he aid or abet any enemy against the state of Missouri during that time that he is charged with having done so. And yet, said prisoner has been committed to Liberty Jail, Clay County, Missouri for treason. He has continually offered bail to any amount that could be required, notwithstanding your petitioners allege that he ought to have been acquitted. And your petitioners allege that he is not guilty of any crime, whereby he should be restrained of his liberty, and that he has never acted at any time only in his own defense, and that too on his own ground, property, and possessions. That the prisoner has never commanded any military company, nor held any military authority, neither any other office, real or pretended, in the state of Missouri, except that of a religious teacher. That he never has borne arms in the military ranks, and in all such cases he has acted as a private character and as an individual. How then, your petitioners would ask, can it be possible the prisoner has committed treason? That was incredibly relevant here. Okay, so Joseph said, I was never a military leader. I never held any office in the state of Missouri. I never had any military company or held any military authority. I never personally bore arms. Never at any point should I have been treated as a military combatant or leader. I was purely a religious teacher. The lines are blurry in this case, but Joseph made a relevant point. The court of inquiry was held for a military capacity. If there was a military actor, a military leader who acted with the actions that Joseph did, those are treasonous and deserving of the death penalty. But Joseph wasn't a military actor. He was just a religious leader, and he sort of had his own military, his own like quasi-military mob of Danites and Army of Israel guys who were running around armed and intimidating judges and stuff like that. But, you know, Joe actually never was inducted into any military office. So these are relevant points, and obviously Judge Tompkins, as he was reading this letter, must have been wrestling with these same points as well. But the next section that we're going to read, it's just as relevant, and we're almost done with this thing, but it gets into some incredible denials of historical facts. And laying the blame on other people. Joe talks about Dr. Samson Avard and George M. Hinkle being the leaders of the Danites, claiming that they intimidated Joe into silence so that they could perform the Mormon depredations in Daviess County. They were Joe's fall guys. There are a lot of holes in Joe's story here, but he had been locked up for 5 months. He was willing to say basically anything to Judge Tompkins in order to get another court appearance to somehow end the suffering that was happening in Liberty Jail. So he goes on to say, the prisoner has had nothing to do in Daviess County, only on his own business as an individual. That the testimony of Dr. Avard concerning a council held at James Sloan's was false. That's talking about the organization of the Danites. Your petitioners do solemnly declare that there was no such council, that your petitioners were with the prisoner, and there was no such vote nor conversation as Dr. Avard swore to. That Dr. Avard also swore falsely considering a constitution, as he said was introduced among the saints. It's talking about, of course, the Constitution of the Danites. That the prisoner had nothing to do with the burning in Daviess County. That the prisoner made public proclamation against such things. That the prisoner did oppose Dr. Avard and George Hinkle against vile measures with the mob, but was threatened by them if he did not let them alone. That the prisoner did not have anything to do with what is called Bogart's battle, for he knew nothing of it until it was all over, that he was at home and in the bosom of his own family during the time of the whole transaction, and in fine, your petitioners allege that he is held in confinement without cause and under an unlawful and tyrannical oppression, and that his health and constitution and life depend on being liberated from his confinement. And further, your petitioners testified that the said Joseph Smith Jr. did make a public proclamation in Far West in favor of the militia of the state of Missouri, and of its laws and also of the Constitution of the United States. Come on. That he has ever been a warm friend to his country and did use all his influence for peace. That he is a peaceable and quiet citizen and is not worthy of death or stripes, bonds, or imprisonment. The above-mentioned speech was delivered on the day before the surrender at Far West, and it is signed Allenson Ripley, Heber Kimball, William Huntington, Joseph Noble, and Joseph Smith, Jr. End quote. Okay, that was a long thread to read through, but it was important because Joe made his case for us in this very letter to exhibit that he's somehow innocent of everything and that Samson Avard and George Hinkle were responsible for everything the Mormons did unlawfully in Missouri. And Joe even said, I stood in the public square and made a public proclamation in Far West the day before our surrender that the state of Missouri and that everything that they're doing is a good thing and it's in line with the Constitution of the United States. And that's just simply not true. Joe was claiming that it wasn't the leader himself who was responsible for what the Mormons did. It was all because of these guys, these fall guys, who had incidentally been excommunicated by Bloody Brigham by the time that Judge Tompkins actually read this letter. They were the people responsible for doing everything that the Mormons did in the Mormon-Missouri conflict. But it wasn't just Joe who filed this one petition to Judge Tompkins. What we read includes those guys that I listed and who signed it at the end, but attached in this same file, which was sent to Judge Tompkins, were separate petitions from Caleb Baldwin and Alexander McCrae. They were forced to make their own petitions to the judge saying very similar things. After this plea was sent and Joe had told Isaac Galland that he wanted to buy everything that the guy had had, Joe sat down to pen a letter to his wife, Emma, once again, from the josephsmithpapers.org. Check the show notes. This is a letter from Joseph to Emma Smith, dated April 4th, 1839. Dear and affectionate wife, Thursday night I sat down just as the sun is going down, as we peek through the grates of this lonesome prison to write to you, that I make known to you my situation. It is, I believe, it is now about 5 months and 6 days that I have been under the grimace of a guard night and day. and within the walls, grates, and squeaking of iron doors of a lonesome, dark, dirty prison. With emotions known only to God do I write this letter. The contemplations of the mind under these circumstances defies the pen or tongue or angels to describe or paint to the human mind being who never experience what we experience. This night we expect is the last night we shall try our weary joints and bones on our dirty straw couches in these walls. Let our case hereafter be as it may, as we expect to start tomorrow for Daviess County for our trial. We shall have a change of venue to some of the lower counties for the final trial, as our lawyers generally say, if law can be adhered to in Daviess, as it grants us the privilege. But you are aware of what we may expect, of beings that conducted as they have. My dear Emma, I think of you and the children continually. If I could tell you my tale, I think you would say it was altogether enough for once to gratify the malice of hell that I have suffered. I want to see little Frederick, Joseph, Julia, and Alexander, Jonah, and old Major. And as to yourself, if you want to know how much I want to see you, examine your feelings, how much you want to see me, and judge, for I would gladly go from here to you barefoot and bareheaded and half naked to see you and think it a great pleasure. And never count it toil, but do think I am babyish, for I do not feel so. I bear with fortitude all my oppression. So do those that are with me. Not one of us have flinched yet. I want you not let the little fellows forget me. Tell them Father loves them with a perfect love, and that he is doing all he can to get away from the mob that come to them. Do teach them all you can, that they may have good minds. Be tender and kind to them. Don't be fractious unto them, but listen to their wants. Tell them Father says they must be good children. Mind their mother. My dear Emma, there is a great responsibility resting upon you in preserving yourself in honor and sobriety before them and teaching them right things, to form their young and tender minds, that they begin in right paths and not get contaminated when young. But seeing ungodly examples, I suppose you see the need of my counsel and help. But as a combination, things have conspired to place me where I am, and I know it not my fault. And further, if my voice and counsel had been heeded, I should not have been here. But I find no fault with you. At all I know nothing but what you have done the best you could. If there is anything it is known to yourself, you must be your own judge on that subject. And if either of us have done wrong, it is wise in us to repent of it. And for God's sake, do not be so foolish as to yield to the flattery of the devil, falsehoods, and vanity in this hour of trouble, that our affections be drawn away from the right objects. Those precious things God has given us will rise up in judgment against us in the day of judgment, against us if we do not mark well our steps and ways. Signed, yours, Joseph Smith. End quote. There's a lot more in that letter that we could talk about. I did cut a couple of chunks out, but, it's not terribly relevant. Just go read it for yourself and see what you think. But the takeaway that I'm able to pull from this, Joe basically just told Emma to be super faithful and not to give in to temptation and to be a good mom. Stuff she never could have known without him telling her in this letter, right? But he still didn't really make reference to how much he loves her or try to come up with an analogy. He talks about the kids and says that he would walk miles barefoot and naked to see her, but still he didn't devote any of his amazing talents with words to telling Emma how much he loves and misses her. He just said, if you want to know how much I miss you, think about how much you miss me. The letter is historically relevant, just as it is relevant to giving us a window into what Joe and Emma's relationship was going through at this time. It must have been hard for them. But Joe told Emma that he and the other prisoners would only be spending one more night in Liberty Jail before they were transferred to have a hearing in front of the Honorable Judge George Tompkins. The petition worked. This transfer was granted, and the Mormon leaders finally had a brief grand jury trial to ascertain legitimate charges. Judge George Tompkins heard their case on April 11th, 1839, and delivered a judgment the following day. He turned around and officially charged Joe and the others with every single charge the court of inquiry had charged against them. But Tompkins also knew how hard it was to deal with the Mormons. He didn't want to acquit them of their charges, as it would likely be the end of his career. He didn't want to charge them with anything more because, what else do you possibly charge them with? You already landed murder, treason, arson, and theft, a death sentence in most states back then. Somebody, there's no way of really knowing who, I don't think, came up with the only possible way to somehow put justice on hold and make the best of the situation. If the Mormons couldn't get justice in Missouri, at least the state wouldn't be responsible for killing them, which was the inevitable conclusion to a full conviction of these charged offenses. So somebody issued a writ to transfer the prisoners to Boone County instead of Caldwell or Davies. A man named Sheriff William Morgan took custody of the prisoners. And I'm going to let a legitimate historian tell the story from here. Now, it should be noted that Brody claims in No Man Knows My History that Joe was the person who petitioned for the change of venue, but I can't seem to verify that as the claim isn't necessarily cited. So this is an excerpt from page 56 to 57 of Pistol Packin' Porter's seminal biography by Harold Schindler, titled Orrin Porter Rockwell, Man of God, Son of Thunder. Isn't that a great title for a biography about this guy? But it says, quote, in early April 1839, the prisoners were returned to Gallatin to appear before a grand jury. On April 12th, the panel returned a true bill against Joseph, Hiram, White, McCrae, and Baldwin for murder, treason, burglary, arson, larceny, theft, and stealing. Rigdon had previously been admitted to bail and had fled Missouri to join church members at Quincy, Illinois. Quite unexpectedly, 3 days later, the court ordered a change of venue, and the 5 Mormons were placed in the custody of Sheriff William Morgan to be transferred to Boone County for sentencing. It was apparent that the move was being made in a deliberate maneuver to provide the prisoners with a chance to make a break. While many Missourians still pressured to have the Mormons hanged, several officials in high places, perhaps Boggs himself, had come to the realization that an escape would be convenient to all concerned, since the fugitives certainly would leave the state at the first opportunity. And it was unlikely that they would return with a grand jury indictment hanging over their heads. Accordingly, Sheriff Morgan and his guards conveniently became intoxicated during the ride to Boone County. Late that night, the 5 prisoners galloped across the border into Illinois. With the Mormon prophet out of their grasp, the enraged Missouri population completely razed church settlements in Davies, Clay, Caldwell, and Ray counties, shooting livestock, firing homes, and stealing everything left behind. The handful of remaining saints hastily packed what they could and made tracks for Illinois. Little love was lost between the Illinoisans and the Missouri neighbors, and when the story of the Mormon expulsion spread across the state line, the people of the town of Quincy were quick to offer solace and hospitality. They also extended a blanket invitation to the saints to resettle in Illinois, a suggestion the Mormons eagerly accepted. Now from later on in the page. Exhausted and hungry, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Lyman White, Alexander McCrae, and Caleb Baldwin rode into Quincy on April 22nd. Thank God we have been delivered, the prophet said as his friends and family ran to embrace him. Among them was Orrin Porter Rockwell. End quote. The prophet was finally free. Having set up this escape plan with unknown entities and then successfully bribing Sheriff William Morgan and his men with some powerful sweetened whiskey, Joe and Hiram and the other men effected their escape from Missouri to Illinois without looking back. One of the reasons that Joe wasn't let out during that habeas corpus hearing along with Rigdon when he was released was because the authorities knew that Joe would abscond as soon as he was released. That's why he was stuck in prison for over 5 months. Joe was slippery when it came to the law. This was still over half a century before the FBI was created and there was any legitimate structured interstate police force in existence. This had been a recurring theme for states since the Articles of Confederation were drawn up. How do states police criminals who cross state lines? The Missouri law enforcement knew that Joe would cross a state line as soon as he could escape the clutches of the jailers, which he did, nullifying their jurisdiction over him. Joe kind of made a habit of removing himself from a state where there were criminal charges against him, whether that was New York, Ohio, or Missouri, or anywhere in between. Joe was quick to flee the state and escape the other state's enforcement jurisdiction when trouble ever arose. Now, word spread to the saints on the banks of the Mississippi that the prophet would be heard in court for a grand jury trial. Many of the Mormons were of the opinion that the whole thing was religious persecution, just like Joe and Rigdon had been claiming all along. They'd been told by the leadership the whole time that the Missouri government are all mobocrats and they're hell-bent on persecuting the Mormons, and the persecution narrative was literally real to these people. I mean, Mormons today don't understand all the factors that went into the Mormons being removed from Missouri, and I would wager to guess that many Mormons back then didn't even know all the reasons. You know, it likely seemed to be just strictly religious persecution to the vast majority of the Mormons, the same way it's viewed by Mormons today. But, of course, as we know, that ignores massive swaths of competing factors and complicated politics, which actually played into the situation much more so than the religious aspect ever did. Some of the sections that I cut out of the petition to Judge George Tompkins were these massive chunks where Joe just tells the judge how everybody in Missouri was against him and the Mormons. He was terribly abused by the Missouri militia, that he was completely innocent and could prove himself such if given the opportunity to state his case. We read a little bit of that, but I promise I did cut a lot of it out for the sake of redundancy. Well, just like in the court of inquiry, usually grand trials, the defendant doesn't get to state their case. The grand jury is held by the prosecution to determine if there's enough evidence to move forward with a full jury trial. However, according to Brody, Joe did make the petition to change venue to Boone County to get an objective panel of judges, which the court accepted. It was during that transfer to Boone County that Joe and friends were able to flee the drunken clutches of Sheriff Morgan and his men and make their way across the state line to Illinois. And, of course, thanks to the lack of interstate law enforcement, nobody had jurisdiction to follow Joe and enforce the grand jury indictment for what were capital offenses. The bribe that Joe offered Sheriff Morgan was well known publicly, and it was rather substantial. But it was a very small price to pay when taken on balance of the death penalty inevitably awaiting Joe. In addition to the whiskey sweetened with honey, they also agreed upon $800 and payment for the horses. A few weeks after this, somebody spotted Sheriff Morgan in Quincy actually collecting on his bribe. The Missourians were understandably not pleased. But in the grand scheme of things, the whole Mormon problem had essentially been solved. So the Missourians didn't pursue any legal action against the sheriff for his corruption in accepting the bribe. The majority of the Missourians just ignored the Mormons by the end of April 1839. As there were so few Mormons remaining in Missouri to even bother the anti-Mormon citizens there. But really, let's take a step back. When it all comes down to it, wasn't this the best possible solution? Consider what should have happened versus what did happen. And let's use our tools to skepticize what the best option was. I'm all for people paying the price when they break the law, but it's important to be reasonable and consider the real legal ramifications of any situation that's this incredibly complex. Ideally speaking, this is ideally, Joe and the other dozen-plus members of Mormon leadership should have appeared in front of a Missouri court in a county where they hadn't influenced the public one way or another, trying to get some form of an unbiased judge and peer system. And the prosecution should have been able to charge the Mormons with everything they charged and then put them in jail until a proper jury trial happened. In addition to that, Joe and the Mormons should have filed a countersuit against the state of Missouri for wrongful treatment and not protecting life, liberty, and free exercise of the Mormons, which would have dragged in Colonel Thomas Jennings and his men for executing the Hans Mill massacre without any orders. And that was a malicious capital offense perpetrated by a state-sanctioned militia commanding officer. That's a sticky situation. Judgment would have come down one way or another, and the Mormons and their leaders would have been entangled in a legal battle for years to come, trying to get Joe freed from jail, as well as some kind of recourse for being removed from Missouri on nothing more than surrender charges, with a bunch of wrongful deaths from the state militia officials. Joe likely would have spent years in jail until he could be acquitted of all the charges against him for treason and arson and all that stuff, or until the conviction would have gone through and the long process of appeals prior to an execution would have begun. If the chips did fall that way, Joseph Smith may very well have been executed by the United States government for treason and murder. If all of this went according to law, I mean. But that would also require classifying him as a military commanding officer, as opposed to a religious leader, which is tough to do. But given the Mormons' history in Missouri, those lines were pretty blurry when it came right down to everything that Joe had done. But think on that. How would executing a religious leader look in Missouri's record of case law? The point is, some variation of this hypothetical we're talking about right now should have happened ideally to get what we would call a fair trial. Not necessarily speedy, but fair and legal. Well, the state of Missouri was in a bad legal spot in different ways than the Mormons, but everybody had broken the law and the Missouri government had violated the Constitution. If this case got out of hand, the spotlight would be on Missouri to handle this the right way, more so than it already was, to see how they would handle the Mormon situation. I mean, damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? The whole legal scenario was unpopular for different groups of different people for different reasons. This was a no-win conundrum. The state could go through all of this and spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and a number of years convicting Joseph Smith to the death penalty after they'd already spent millions on the whole Mormon-Missouri conflict so far. No possible outcome looked good for anybody that was involved. So, what was the simplest solution? You just let him escape. It is the most pragmatic compromise where nobody's actually satisfied, but at least people aren't rioting in the streets because, like, the government executed a religious leader or because they let a traitor who killed American soldiers go free. I mean, it's a no-win proposition, right? With an escape, all you're doing is just looking the other way and then passively exporting the Mormon problem to the next sucker of a state to take them in, which just so happened to be Illinois in this case. It really was the only reasonable way to handle this without years of court battles and countless expended resources to bring the Mormon leaders to justice, which would uncover a lot of bad moves on the state's part that they would much rather not discuss. Nobody wanted to deal with this problem, which is made even clearer when we consider that the petition to form a committee investigating how the Mormons were treated by the Missouri government was tabled until July of 1839. That's 2.5 months after the prophet had escaped from the clutches of Sheriff William Morgan, and many more months after nearly every Mormon was gone and their houses were all burned to the ground. Everybody wanted the Mormon problem to go away. And it did. Rigdon and the other church leaders had done well in befriending Isaac Galland. Once Joe escaped, he was made aware of the forces Galland had been exerting to help the Mormons in Illinois and Iowa. Here's a couple of brief excerpts of a letter exchange between Isaac Galland and Governor Lucas of Iowa. This is also taken from Dan Vogel's Source and Critical Text History of the Church, Volume 3. This is on pages 291 and 292. This is from Isaac Galland's letter. The testimony of Governor Lucas as to the good moral character of these people, the Mormons, I think will have its deserved influence upon the people of Illinois in encouraging our citizens in their humane and benevolent exertions to relieve this distressed people who are now wandering in our neighborhoods without comfortable food, raiment, or a shelter from the pelting storm. That was sent to Lucas by Isaac Galland, saying, hey, the Mormons are really getting screwed over, so hopefully if you, Governor Lucas, say that the Mormons are cool, then maybe people everywhere will be cool with them. And this is what Governor Lucas sent back to Isaac Galland. I received your letter on the 25th, in which you give a short account of the sufferings of the people called the Mormons and ask whether they could be permitted to purchase lands and settle upon them in the territory of Iowa and there worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own conscience, secure from oppression, etc. And it goes later on in the letter to say, in answer to your inquiry, I would say that I know of no authority that can constitutionally deprive them of this right. No person demeaning himself in a peaceable and orderly manner shall ever be molested on account of his mode of worship or religious sentiments in said territory. These principles, I trust, will ever be adhered to in the territory of Iowa. They make no distinction between religious sects. They extend equal privileges and protections to all. Each must rest upon its own merits, and will prosper in proportion to the purity of its principles, and the fruit of holiness and piety produced thereby. Signed, Governor Robert Lucas of Iowa. End quote. So Isaac Galland was a powerful ally to have, and he made himself a critical asset to Joe and the church. Now, really, without him, who knows how the church would have landed in Illinois, or even if they would have remained there. They may have been forced to move out to Utah early or something, who knows? I mean, it makes you wonder about this. If only the Mormons had done this same schmoozing with Governor Boggs when they first began to move into Jackson County, Missouri, maybe the whole 1838 Mormon War just wouldn't have happened, and the Mormons may never have been removed from Missouri in the first place. You know, that's just one of those historical thought experiments that are fun to occasionally play with, but you wonder how things would have gone differently if Governor Boggs didn't hate the Mormons. And that's a valid takeaway, right? If you're going to settle in a previously unsettled area, it may benefit you to make friends with the authorities in that area. Joe and the Mormons had settled in a number of areas en masse without really talking to relevant people about it before doing so. I mean, take that example of Jackson County, Missouri. They didn't talk to the legislature or any of the government, for that matter, when they first set their sights on independence. They just came in and declared independence as their holy land, the Mormon Zion. Well, what happened in the Bible when somebody was on the Israelites' promised land? What happened to the Canaanites, Midianites, Amalekites, and a number of the other ites who were lost to history once Yahweh decided that they were on the Israelites' promised land? Was it really that irrational to think that the Mormons may treat the Missourites the same way as the Israelites treated the Canaanites and Midianites? Well, yeah, I mean, it is kind of irrational, but Joe didn't always operate within the boundaries of rationality. When the Mormons were chased out of Jackson County in 1833, Joe led an army of 200 men to Jackson County for the purpose of restoring the Mormons to Zion? What did that look like in his mind? Did that really mean open armed conflict? If it didn't mean open armed conflict, then why were all 200 men armed in the first place? Come on, there was only one reason to march 200 armed men over 800 miles. I guess the overall point would be that Joe figured out when he needed help, and to let the people who were in the proper position do what they could to help him. You know, Galland was a wealthy landowner the governor needed to be aware of and approve the Mormons moving in. Bloody Brigham was good with running businesses. Hinchpin Rigdon was able to schmooze the necessary people when he told them of the Mormons' persecution in Missouri. Every one of these people played their part in getting the Mormons situated in Illinois to the point that they could build a new community from scratch. The swath of land which the church purchased from Galland, called Commerce, was just a swampland with a couple of dinky rundown farms on it. You fast forward 4 years, and Nauvoo, Illinois was a sprawling metropolis with a population rivaling Chicago of nearly exclusively Mormons. In order to construct his empire, Joe needed a lot of help. And the people were willing to do their duty to Zion. And that's going to do it for the historical portion of this week's episode. For those of you who are patrons on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, just want to let you know, next Monday from when this airs, it's going to be on June 5th. We're going to be doing our Namo Home Evening, as we do every month. And this month's special guest is my good friend Deb, or Heretic Woman, from Atheist on Air Beyond the Trailer Park. She and I have been good friends for, well, basically since I started doing this, and I'm stoked to finally have her to come on my show. I did just go over and make an appearance on Beyond the Trailer Park. There will be a link for that in the show notes, but be sure to check out that if you want to hear us talking about Mormonism. And if you are a patron, come and hang out with us on Google Hangouts. That's going to begin on June 5th, Monday, beginning at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That leaves enough time for all of those East Coasters to be able to still tune in before bedtime. So we don't have any new patrons to thank this time around, but I will just say thank you to all of the patrons who do support the show and keep this rolling. Your hard-earned cash definitely is converted into the research and development that you find in this podcast. So thank you so much for all of those who do support. Once again, before killing it tonight, I do want to just remind everybody, survey.libsyn.com/Naked Mormonism podcast. If you don't mind going on and filling out that survey, that just helps us to get some information on the listening audience of the show. It would be really deeply appreciated for anybody who is willing to take the 30 seconds, the 45 seconds in order to do that. Check the show notes as well as the Facebook page for when this episode airs, and you will see a link available to it there. And if you have any suggestions beyond what is included in the survey, I'd love to hear what you have to say at nakedmormonism@gmail.com. That's the best way to get a hold of me and talk to me directly, and I try and be as respondent as possible to those emails. And thank you to those of you who do write in. Just another reminder, we are fast approaching Sunstone and the live show and hangout that Marie and I are doing on July 29th. We're just, we're just about 2 months away from that. So we do have the event available for free for everybody at Squatters Pub on July 29th. We do have pinned posts on both of our Facebook pages, and people can say if they're coming or if they're interested and whatnot, and, engage in the comment threads that we have going on those. So if you are in the Salt Lake City area, or you're going to be for Sunstone Symposium at the end of July, we would love to see you at Squatters Pub on that Saturday night. It'll be really fun to get together and hang out and spend some time doing a live show there, a live My Book of Mormon podcast with Marie. I'm really looking forward to that. Beyond that, I think we are all set for today, and I think we are ready to shut it down. But, of course, before doing so, there are a few people that keep this place running behind the scenes that I owe my undying gratitude to. I'll begin by thanking, of course, Demonista and Julianne for running the Facebook and Twitter handles. The two of them keep the social media networks going and keep the conversation active there. Thank you both so much for doing that. I also need to thank Craig Keeling. He provided the artwork that's used in this show, so be sure to go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog there and all kinds of real weird Mormon shit that he posts up there. Also go to A Lost State of Mind to hear more of Jason Camo's music, and he's the guy that created the music you're listening to right now, used with his permission. I need to thank Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast for providing legal services for this show. I deeply appreciate him and his friendship. Be sure to check out Opening Arguments. Also, I need to thank all of the patrons once again for supporting the show, for keeping this a full-time endeavor. And above everything else, I need to thank all of the amazing listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. Do any of you ex-Mormons out there still get hymns that just crop up randomly in your brain? You know, you're thinking, man, I got a lot to do today. Got to keep my shoulder to the wheel. And then for the rest of the day, you're whistling or humming, put shoulder to the wheel, push along. Or, you're getting ready for the weekend, working on Saturday, thinking how special of a day it is. It's the day that we all get ready for Sunday. Now, Father's Day is coming up really soon. And are you going to throw your arms around your dad's neck and give him a big, wet kiss? It's incredible how deep that shit runs, isn't it? When you're indoctrinated and taught songs from a very young age, songs are a repetitive, incredible thing that the human brain can somehow repeat with perfect repetition, seemingly endlessly, right? How many of us learn songs from a young age, and those songs can randomly appear in our minds today in perfect form, with every single note intact? How many of us could stand up, ex-Mormons who haven't been a member for 1 year, 5 years, 20 years, how many of us could stand together and sing If You Could Hide a Kolob together in a room at an ex-Mormon conference? And everybody else joined in too. I mean, these are powerful techniques used that are applicable to our everyday lives. You know, something will happen in my day-to-day life, and it's like, man, praise to this man for creating this amazing religion that I'm able to study. Yeah, that's what it is. Something will come along that makes me think of a hymn, and then the stage is set. I can't think of anything but that hymn for the next few hours until somehow I hear something else to get that thing shaken out of my brain. The internal folds of my brain matter, it just gets trapped in there and bounces around the neuronal synapses, firing and exploding back and forth to each other, just echoing this song over and over and over. Put your shoulder to the wheel. Are you going to have it stuck in your head now like I am? That's what happens when you go onto the ex-Mormon Reddit. You run into assholes like this that make posts, put your shoulder to the wheel, and then you have this song stuck in your head for hours after that. But it still makes me think about hymns kind of in a meta perspective. Songs are a powerful thing. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.